Next up, we are going to discuss understanding the Toronto real estate market at a high level, how the market actually works. And we have to break this all down for you, Jerome Werniuk at Fox Marin. Jerome, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Ralph. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here, especially on this topic. I know you work with a lot of first time home buyers and you are pretty familiar with their pain points and what's on their mind. So, who better to speak to the market at a high level than yourself? So, let's get into it. One thing that can be really confusing for somebody entering the market, like what is freehold versus condo versus townhouse? At a high level, can you break down the different asset classes and maybe just very quickly the pros and cons to each?
Yeah, for sure. I think like a touch of history is relevant in here. There was not a lot of condo buildings when they started building homes in Toronto. And if you go back to sort of the earliest era of residential real estate here in Toronto, call it like the mid to late 1800s, what was really only getting built were townhomes, semi-detached, and detached homes. And this is in old Toronto. So think about like Roncesvalles or High Park, all the way over to sort of Leslieville. And a lot of those homes, red brick homes, they've got 2 to 4 bedrooms, usually about 1,000 to 2,000 square feet, not including the basement. There weren't a lot of cars being driven around in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So there's not a lot of priority to parking. And those types of homes, it's kind of like your first entry level freehold property. And they're really appealing usually to people that are planning to have families and really want to be in a walkable neighborhood where they can walk out of their front door, maybe walk down to their office or take the streetcar. And then you kind of go into the next segment outside of that. After sort of 1918 and the World War One, you started to have Toronto expand and grow, and houses continued to get built further and further out, usually with larger lots and larger home sizes. Most of those are detached homes. So you think about Scarborough, North York. If you're going to the west, out in Etobicoke and kind of getting into the border of Mississauga, and a lot of those homes appeal to people that don't necessarily value walking out of their front door and walking to a coffee shop, but they prioritize space and they want a bigger home, they want a big backyard, and they're okay driving into the city. And our third asset class, I guess, within this comes a lot later. Condo developments really started in the 1980s, but they didn't kick off until the early 2000s, until we've had like our big condo boom. And a lot of that came from freehold properties, those townhome semis and detached, really just being unaffordable to your middle class typical family. And condos were the obvious alternative. Also, people wanted to enjoy those amenities downtown, be able to walk places, couldn't afford to be there and didn't want to have to drive in. And so we've had this massive condo boom from basically early 2000s until 2022. And the main advantages to those is that it's a really easy lifestyle. You quite often have a ton of security. You've got a lot of amenities within your building that you would normally have to leave a semi-detached home and walk to or drive to. The problem with condos, and I don't want to touch too much on it, is that a lot of them that have been built over the last 25 years have really been geared towards single individuals or couples. We haven't really built a lot of condominiums for families that accommodate one, two, or definitely not three children. So most of the condos we have today are usually going to be, sort of 500 to 900 square feet. And most of them are studios, one beds and two beds. We have very few 3-bed condominiums. So to each their own, but those are really how the three asset classes break down.
Awesome. That was a really good high level explanation, and it can get confusing. What does freehold mean and what are the differences? So, thank you for that, Jerome. Let's talk about markets. Like, there is, to my mind, no such thing as the Toronto real estate market. It is, the GTA is just so massive, and it really is just an average of a bunch of submarkets or micro markets. And each market has its own micro market, has its own feel to itself and its own valuations and its own ebbs and flows. And two neighboring micro markets can be completely different from one another. So, do you want to talk a little bit, especially about the ones in the areas that we work in central and downtown Toronto?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, with a first time buyer, that's really kind of the first decision or larger decision they're going to make is before you get out and start looking at houses, you kind of want to figure out which of those micro markets appeals to you. A lot of the things around those decisions, whether it's Roncesvalles or Leslieville or the beaches or North Riverdale, is what's important to you in proximity to your home. So if you want a really short walk to the office and still live in a residential feeling neighborhood, Leslieville is about as close as it possibly gets to downtown while still having a very residential feel to it. If you go over to Roncesvalles, it's a little further away. It's a longer commute, but you have access to High Park, which is just incredible. It's our central park in Toronto where you can go on the weekend, spend an entire day there and get lost. Within that, you have a lot of other sort of pros and cons to these micro markets. So, for example, in Cabbagetown, beautiful old Victorian neighborhood, absolutely perfectly preserved. It's really bad for parking. So, like if you're going out with the family to hockey practice every single weekend, it can be challenging because you're coming back and there's a pile of snow on the one parking space available on Sackville, and you're out of luck. These micro markets, quite often people will start by saying, well, I really like this one. And a good real estate agent is going to kind of push their limits and say, well, have you considered this? Let me bring you over to that neighborhood. And usually, first time buyers start out by exploring a bunch of different neighborhoods and then kind of scaling back from there and focusing in on one or two before making a decision of ultimately where they want to live.
It's interesting because not only does Toronto have a lot of micro neighborhoods, but each one really has its own character and feel from another. So Trinity Bellwoods is very different from neighboring Little Portugal. And so part of it is if you're a first time buyer is really getting into where you want to be and where it feels most like home. And we have these older established neighborhoods like the ones I just mentioned, or you have your Liberty Village or Fort York as well on the flip side to that. And so a large discovery that has to happen when you're a first time buyer, aside from your actual working budget from a financial standpoint, is what type of property do you want? What characteristics do you want it to have? And then where do you really want it to be? And it's a very common homework assignment to give to clients where it's like, okay, well, if you have a free weekend, go spend some time in Corktown, go spend some time in the St. Lawrence market, go to Cabbagetown, go feel these areas. And then if it starts to feel like home and there's an alignment in terms of affordability, then it requires a little bit more due diligence from there. But it's really important to do your due diligence and not necessarily jump into something because that's when you get into a situation where you might have buyer's regret.
100%.
Okay, let's talk about data just at a very high level, the data that comes out from TRREB and how we look at it. And just at a very high level, where are the important markers when you're trying to understand the market?
Yeah, every month the Toronto Real Estate Board produces what's called the market report.
Mhm.
And this is picked up primarily by the media. It's obviously read by real estate professionals and buyers, but that's where you get the big headlines. And the numbers or data that's being typically referred to are generally the total number of sales in the previous month, the average sale price, the average days on market. And those three metrics are usually being compared to the previous year. And so a big headline will come out saying, sales at lowest rate in November since 1991, and you have to kind of parse through that data and figure out what it means. It's good to have these sort of macro benchmarks to figure out what's happening. However, I do find that a lot of the TREB data is kind of a blunt instrument. Just as we're talking about micro markets, you can have a house sitting in North York for 5 months, not selling for any reason, and 10 offers on a house in the pocket where there's a ton of demand. And so when you're extrapolating data from 1,000 detached home sales in a month spread all over the city, it gives you some information to work with, but the micro neighborhood information is really what is going to end up being important when you get further in the buying process and are actually ready to put pen to paper.
100%. I've always found, though, the best way when you're trying to assess a market or investing in something you don't have a lot of familiarity with, it's always good to start with the macro and then slowly shrink it right into the micro where it's most relevant to what you're actually searching for. But those metrics, days on the market, they still apply when you're looking on the micro level as well. So it's really important to understand the data and then to be able to drill down on it specific to a street or specific to a building. And this is one thing I wanted to touch upon. Why do you see differentials in streets? Like once, almost sometimes it's one side of a street and another side of a street, or two neighboring streets, just like you will with buildings. You'll see two condo buildings side by side, and you'll see a very big spread between the price per square foot and the actual days on the market of condos in those buildings. So how do you account for that? Because it's something that somebody who's a new buyer really has to get their head around.
Yeah, it comes down usually to sort of three or four main things when you see a dramatic difference in price from one side of the street to the next, or north of Queen versus south of Queen, whatever the case is. A lot of that is often driven by school catchment area. Like there's a school a lot of people in the East End know up in Plater Estates called Jackman, and you'll see pretty much every single real estate listing that comes out referenced in the coveted Jackman School District. Now, Jackman typically scores pretty high for EQAO results and subsequently gets usually a good Fraser Institute ranking, which is sort of our gold standard for ranking school performance and student performance across Canada. And so quite often parents will want to move into a catchment area that is in a school that is rated very highly. And one side of the street could be in one catchment area, the other side of the street could be in a different catchment area. And so that will factor into buyer psychology of what a home is worth and saying, I'm willing to pay an extra 40 grand to make sure my kid goes to the school I want to. Separate from that, you can have busy streets and quiet streets, even within quiet residential neighborhoods. If you think about the East End, there's streets like Mortimer, which kind of on just a general map don't look like a major street. If you stand on Mortimer, you will see buses going by every 3 minutes, and you'll see a lot of cars trying to cut across the East End. And so you can have a house that's 5 houses down on a quiet residential street just off of Mortimer that's going to trade on an apples to apples basis for 10 or 15% higher just because of the quietness of that street. Beyond that, and particularly when you get in that transitional area from sort of old Toronto, 1890s, early 1900s homes to 1920s, 1930s, one side of the street could have a lot smaller lots with different home styles compared to the other side of the street that has extra 2 or 3 feet of lot width, which when you factor that into interior width and layouts can make for a dramatically different property layout and a different lifestyle, even from one side of the street to the next. Parking situation is also a huge one. There's some streets that are just an absolute nightmare to street park, particularly in the wintertime. And if you can't find a parking spot out front of your house and you don't have dedicated parking, that could dramatically impact lifestyle. And if you add up all the minutes you spend over 25 years circling the block looking for parking, there's some value that's attached to that. So you've got good streets for parking, bad streets for parking. And the next one, I think this one is more important as you get out sort of into the fringes of old Toronto or Toronto proper, is proximity to green space is really important to some people. Backing onto a ravine, being across from Kew Gardens and the beaches, being across from High Park on Parkside is actually a negative. And so depending on the green space, depending on the neighborhood, that can also dramatically impact the price of a home to everything in the immediate area.
And just for a second, let's talk about condos and how you can have two buildings side by side trade at completely different prices. Each building is almost a market onto itself, or certainly a submarket. Do you want to touch on that for a sec, Jerome?
Yeah, for sure. One thing to really look into when you're looking at condos is maintenance fees. There's other reasons, but maintenance fees can dramatically impact the value of a condo. And as a reference point, maintenance fees for condos cover everything for the common use of the building. So repairs to the building, heating the common areas, paying for the property manager, making sure snow is shoveled. Everybody contributes a dollar amount based on the number of square feet they own in that condo building. And if you have condo fees or maintenance fees that are high, call it $1.20, $1.30 per square foot, compared to a building across the street that sits at 80 cents per square foot in maintenance fees, that will have a big impact on your monthly payments you're making and therefore depreciate the market value of the condo that has higher maintenance fees on a per square foot basis. Now, outside of that, you have condos that have stigma. There's some condos that are notorious Airbnb party condominiums, and they're across the street from more boutique, smaller buildings that have 80% owner occupiers that really take care of the building itself. They keep it quiet. They create a very pleasant place to live, and it's not really a revolving door hotel. So things like that can dramatically impact the price of condos, even across the street or side by side from one another.
Awesome. And let's round this up and let's talk about market cycles and seasonality. How would you explain this to a first time purchaser who's a little bit less familiar with the market and its dynamics?
Yeah, Toronto's very interesting around this. And if you think about your mental health over the course of 12 months, it quite often operates similar to the Toronto real estate market, where we have some times within the market that there's a lot more listing activity, a lot more sales, usually slightly higher prices, and then times that are a little slower, less listings, less sales, usually slightly lower prices. To break that down annually, let's start off at the beginning of the year. It's the depths of winter, January, February, March. That's when it's dark early. You're getting out of work, you go see a property at 5:30 p.m. and it's pitch black out. It's not a very good environment to go out and get excited to buy a piece of real estate. So during those months, it's kind of like the dark ages of the year. People are generally moving slower, prices are depressed, and you're seeing not as good quality inventory coming to the market. Then people get excited. The snow starts to melt, the flowers start to bloom, and our spring market kicks off, which is statistically the most active market we have at any point in the calendar. There's a lot of good listings that are coming out. A lot of buyers come out to find those listings, and you see prices push up a little bit compared to the beginning of the year. We have a little lull over the summertime. June, July, things start to slow down, and August is very quiet. It's when a lot of people are away traveling with their family, going to cottages over the summer. And if you think about the beginning of the calendar school year for a lot of families being in September, they don't really want to be transacting the month before school starts. They kind of want to get their real estate ducks in a row and everything settled up prior to that. Then we have September, October, November, where we have the fall market, which picks up. Usually not as active as that spring market, but there's a big bump. There's good inventory that comes out, and everybody's kind of rushing in to get things done before the end of the year, and things really quiet down November, December to round it out.
Awesome. When is the best time to buy?
When you're ready to buy, you can afford it and you're confident because you have a good agent to help you guide you through the process.
What a great way to end this conversation. Jerome, thank you so much for bringing the heat. And I'm sure everyone watching this feels the same. So we look forward to seeing you on a future episode.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ralph.